I'm out this morning paddling on Constance Bay. It's a gorgeous calm morning. You can't see it in the video, but there are mayflies rising all around me on the water, and occasionally the stir of a fish rising to take one. But I'm here this morning to talk about sandy soils again. My name is Stow. I'm an ecologist, and this is the ecology of the Ottawa Valley. As I paddle along the shoreline here, you can see two things that make this place interesting to me as an ecologist. The first is this lovely sandy beach, and the second is all the development along the shoreline. We have this lovely sandy beach because Constance Bay is at a point where the Ottawa River opens up much wider, and in the period following the retreat of the glaciers, when the Ottawa River was flowing into the Champlain Sea, the flows would slow at this point, and they would deposit a lot of their sediment, a lot of this sand we see here in this area of the Ottawa River. And that process continues to some extent today. This is still a place where the flows slow down and where sediments tend to get deposited. This is a very shallow bay. It's a great fishing spot. It's a relatively clean bay, which is surprising given the amount of development along the shoreline, because all of this development, all of these homes, will be reliant upon septic tanks for their sewage. And septic tanks, the whole function of a septic tank is to slowly let the effluent leach out into the soil. And here we have these very sandy soils. I've already discussed how quickly we get infiltration through these soils, up to 20 centimeters an hour. And so you would expect that effluent rich in nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, to very quickly get into the lake here, and could lead to problems of eutrophication, that is, very high levels of nutrients that can result in very destructive algal blooms. We're particularly concerned, of course, about blue-green algae, which can produce toxins that are harmful to humans, dogs, and other aquatic life. But the interesting thing here is that that really hasn't happened very much. And it's probably because the Ottawa River fluctuates so much in elevation along through this area over the seasons. Very high in the spring, much lower in the summer. And that tends to push the water in this lake back into those sandy soils. As the water levels rise, the water seeps through those soils, infiltrates into those soils, and then as the water levels drop in the summer, it tends to then infiltrate back out. And it's thought that that may actually contribute to the cleaning of this water, because you can see there's a lot of vegetation. I'm going to point the nose of my canoe actually toward the mouth of Constance Creek, where it comes into the bay. You can see how dense and rich that swamp forest is there. That takes up a lot of nutrients, and when the water levels are high and the water is infiltrating through the sands back into these wooded areas, those trees can take up a lot of the nutrients that are in this water. And so, although it hasn't been very heavily studied, as far as I know. I have spoken with hydrogeologists who feel that this whole process of the water infiltrating back into these swamp forests in the spring and early summer, and then maybe later in the autumn, and then flowing back out, infiltrating back out in the summer months when the water levels are lower. They feel that this may contribute to the cleanliness and the health of this lake. Which is why we have all these beautiful mayflies that are hatching around me. Mayflies are a sign generally of clean water, of healthy water. This morning I paddled across Constance Bay and I talked about the sand deposits around Constance Bay and at the mouth of Constance Creek. This afternoon I'm hiking through the Torbolton Forest, which is the home of the Constance Bay sand hills or sand dunes. Constance Bay is a village at the north end of Ottawa, and the village surrounds a 240-hectare natural area called the Torbolton Forest, which has been preserved for this somewhat unique geological feature called the Constance Bay Sandhills. I'm walking up a slight hill here, which at one time was an open sand dune. Open sandy habitats were quite common in eastern Ontario until the 20th century, when the province, which regarded such areas as wastelands, decided to start planting those areas with trees. And the trees that they selected were usually some type of conifer, like these red pines here. Red pine was probably the most common tree to plant in these sandy soils. White pine was also planted. In some cases, jack pine was planted. These are species that are very tolerant of drought conditions. Here we have some white pine, young white pine, and you can see the needles here. Conifers, needle-bearing trees like this are more resistant to drought because these needles have a waxy coating on them. They have a lower surface area. They don't lose water as quickly, unlike these more broad-leaved shrubs and vines, that one being a vine. The province was well-intentioned when it started to plant trees in these sandy areas like the Constance Bay Sandhills, but there were unintended consequences. The first is that often these places went without the follow-up maintenance that was required to ensure that they were healthy. Conifer plantations, pine plantations require follow-up visits to thin them out. If that doesn't happen, then the trees can become spindly, unhealthy, and prone to breakage. They can also become a fire hazard, and that has long been a concern here in the Torbolton Forest in the middle of the village of Constance Bay. And Forestry Services, Ottawa Forestry Services, has started to manage this forest to reduce the fire risk. Done so over the years through repeated thinnings, clearing in some areas to allow deciduous trees to establish themselves in the forest to produce a more diverse forest. In some cases, forestry has come in and done some planting of trees. The other unfortunate consequence was the loss of the open sand habitat that is important to a number of creatures. Sand habitats like this, these sand dunes, support things like ground beetles that are found nowhere else. They also support things like ground-dwelling wasps, ground-nesting wasps, that will nest here and parasitize some insect pests. These two holes here, these are not ant holes. These are the holes of parasitic wasps, ground nesting wasps. And so the loss of this open sand habitat, the sand habitats that used to be here on these dunes, has resulted in a loss of some species that, as I say, are found really nowhere else. There are places in and around Ottawa where habitat restoration is being done to remove trees from these sandy areas, to reestablish habitat for the creatures that like that sandy habitat. The Pinny sand dunes in the National Capital Greenbelt are a great example where lots of habitat restoration is occurring. When I first came to the Bolton Forest after moving to Ottawa 30 years ago, there was still some remnant open dune habitat, but I have not seen any so far on my walk today, which is unfortunate. You can get a sense here of how high these dunes are by looking down this slope. That slope is, the bottom of that slope is probably 7 to 10 meters below where I'm standing. So these were very, very large sand dunes. I want to thank you for joining me on part 2 of my discussion of sands. I had originally thought I might just have one video on sands and sandy soils, and it expanded to 2 videos, and now I'm thinking I'm going to have 3 videos. Part 3 will be a discussion of eskers and glacial fluvial features such as eskers and drumlins, and I'll be taking us up to the Mayors Bay esker for that discussion. Sandy soils, areas of sand, are just too fascinating not to devote a lot of time to, especially the hydrogeology of them, which I'll be talking a lot more when we go up to Mayors Bay. Thank you for joining me, and hope you come for the next video.